Yes, so I'm Hester. I work as part of Public Works. Before that, I studied at the Royal College of Art, and I did my master's there. So I think this talk is kind of an overview of how my master's project then fed into what I'm now practicing as part of Public Works. So my unit at the RCA was ADS3, which looked at architecture and activism. So we were looking at the idea of how architects can intervene within socio-political issues that are spatial and affecting people in cities, and what are the tactics that you can start to use to challenge power structures or change the way that space is perceived or used. And I was quite interested in the idea of nature and gardening as an activist act. So what's the value of gardening? How does it bring people together? How it can act as a kind of an equalizer for how community groups can operate. But then also looking at how it can also be more subversive and have a sort of an agenda to change the way people are consuming space. So the project was situated on the Carpenter's Estate, which is, some of you might know this, but it's just outside the Olympic Park. And it's a large piece of social housing. It's come in the news quite recently because of the E15 mothers. So they were a group of mothers who squatted the estate when it was emptied as a kind of protest about the idea of social cleansing within London and how councils are moving social tenants outside of London to other cities like Birmingham mainly. And they were looking at the idea of how, as a single mother, what that means for you is you lose your social infrastructure. You can no longer have free childcare because your mother's not down the road. She's back in London and you're in Birmingham. And so they were talking about this sort of idea of social housing and social cleansing as a feminist issue, because basically we're moving mothers away from their infrastructure. So we started working with the few residents who were remaining within these houses. So they were no longer social tenants, but they owned the leasehold or the freehold of their homes, and talked about how we could intervene with this relationship between the council, who own the property, and then the residents who were being forced to move out. And from sort of talking and working with the residents, it became really clear that there was this sort of stalemate between the council and the residents. The residents didn't want to move, but the council had pressure on them that they had to develop this housing. And as a result, you got these kind of quite aggressive moments. So for instance, at one point, the council cut all water and electricity supplies to the estate. And as in by cut, I mean they literally cut the pipe. And so it was really interesting how these moments of sort of tension came out. So the first kind of action we did was to live and work on site. So this is what we worked in. I built this with a colleague called Lisa, who was also in first year. And the idea behind it was our shed. So we would go to the shed and open it up and sit in it during the day. And it became a kind of conversation piece. So to start to engage with people, but also as a kind of commitment to the estate. So saying, we're really interested in what you're doing and we're going to spend a lot of our time here because we think what's happening to you is really important. And so the shed could transform. So the top one is a kiosk. So when we wanted to chat to people, we'd sit facing out either side. Or it could be a big meeting table. So we could sort of show drawings or plans or ideas we had. Or then it could close and then, it's not a great photo, but the bottom bit is a map of the estate. So as a way of kind of talking about their homes. And so from these conversations, I then started to look at legislation around nature and how by using legislation around nature, you could challenge this power structure. So this is the Endangered Species Act, which is on the .gov website. So it's a criminal offence to move, kill, disturb, or injure the larger blue butterfly or the fisher's moth. So I started looking at this idea of if the larger blue butterfly came to the estate, could you decrease the speculative land value, making it harder for the council to develop the land? So I'm not sure how much you know about this, but when a developer goes to buy a piece of land, they do a speculative land value. So they look at basically what would it cost them and what's their profit margin is going to be. So by bringing in the butterfly, you make it more expensive for them to develop the estate. So therefore, the estate starts to drop in their kind of radar of how profitable is this going to be as a project. And I was quite interested in this as a kind of, it's like an activist move, but it's not about often these moments where you try and sort of scare someone away. It's about degrading it, whereas this is actually, in a way from the outside, it's like improving it. This idea of kind of like nature within cities is used a lot by developers, but instead it can be a kind of activist way of protecting the housing from development. So then it kind of went from what was a very live, real project to then trying to push the boundaries of this. If this became a tool that was being used across London, what would these estates look like? What's the kind of urban condition that this is proposing? And in a sense, I suppose the key thing is that nature, which we always see as a kind of rural thing that exists outside the city, would suddenly become a key resource within the city. So I started to look at the greater blue butterfly, which is the one in the image, and sort of, if it were to kind of co-host with the residents, what would this mean architecturally? And it's the sort of idea of, I suppose, urban wilderness and this sort of need for wilderness within the city. And at this point, it became quite utopian as a dystopian, but so the butterfly lives for half the year and then it goes underground for half the year. So for half the year, it would be a criminal offence to walk through the estate. So then the residents would have to move up onto their roofs, and they could no longer go outside. So these sort of additions started to happen around the site. But then I think it was also, at this point, it was kind of looking at the idea of, within sort of like urbanism, there's always talk around making things open and accessible. But actually, if you're talking about protecting land, maybe you also need to have a sense of containment. And that actually these sort of social housing is becoming a sort of defensive landscape. So these are then the sort of drawings of what this would look like. So the idea, you've got these walkways between the homes, the extension out, and then these sort of civic hubs, which become about reuse and the estate coming off-grid, sort of removing itself from the city, but also about having sort of civic forums for people to discuss the nature, and also trying to develop a kind of negotiation between the homes and the nature. I then started to develop these images, and these were kind of made in collaboration with the residents. So on one hand, it's kind of a utopian speculation, but it's also a tool to illustrate the lengths to which residents would go to remain within their homes, and how extreme the housing crisis is, that people are talking about this kind of image being somewhere they'd be prepared to live, to still have their mother living down the road, being able to provide childcare. So I think in a way it's quite interesting, the role of the architect, not necessarily to propose a building that will get built, but also to make visual a condition, or to kind of give an identity to a political situation that's already existing. Some more images. So since graduating from the RCA, I've joined Public Works. So Taranja and Andreas, who were my tutors, founded Public Works with two other artists. And so since then, there's been a body of artists and architects who've worked as part of Public Works. The agenda behind the studio is looking at architecture and activism. So how can you intervene within political situations? And right now, our real focus is about the idea of empowering communities. So how can you facilitate communities to do more self-led projects? So whether that's sort of running their own facilities, like a kind of community centre, or if that's kind of community-led building or community-led planning. So at the moment within the studio, there is me, Andy, Tom, and Carlotta. All four of us were taught by Taranja and Andreas, and we've all, since graduated, gone and got funding for our university projects, and we're now working on them sort of full-time, really. And each of these projects, it's kind of centred around an idea of situated practice. So situated practice is when your project doesn't centre around a skill, but an issue or a topic. And so you work for an extended period of time around that issue or topic, and your kind of outputs will change according to the situation. So I suppose for me, I'm working on a kind of gardening project. Sometimes I act very much as an architect. Sometimes my role is an urban planner, but then other times I might act far more like an artist, community engagement officer, or a graphic designer. So the output's always changing, and as a result, you do a lot of sort of collaborative projects where you'll work with someone else who can kind of bring in skills to the project. So just quickly to give an overview, top right is my project, so that's around the Roman road. Then there's top left is Rurban. So that it was initiated by Andreas, but Carlos works on, and that's around ideas of reuse and recycling within cities and how this can enable urban resilience. Then below that, that's Andy's project. So he was looking at guardianships and what role guardians have within land value and how artists can have a more subversive role within gentrification. So how often artists are brought in as tools for gentrification, but how can you start to challenge that and use your role as an artist to empower the community. And then finally, there's Tom at Loughborough Junction. So I suppose in a way, Tom's quite interesting. Compared with the rest of us, we're doing sort of very small scale community-led projects. And I mean, his has a very strong community element, but since he's graduated, he got 2 million from TfL to build his building. So kind of as an office, Tom works very much day to day like an architect delivering a very big project, whereas I'm far more on the ground working with communities. But I suppose our overall ambition is always about this sort of community-led projects where you're creating assets that the community can then take over. So so from leaving university and doing this project around wilderness, I looked at applying for funding to start an orchard on the Roman road. So this is the boundary of the Roman Road Neighbourhood Forum, which is a project that Public Works has already been working on. And this is the Interact Hub, which Taranj built with a group of students in the area. And so from conversations with residents, it kind of came up that there were these large areas of green spaces within the estates that were really underused and really perceived as sort of municipal and kind of not public spaces as such. And residents wanted to change that. So I put together a funding application to Awards for All. And again, this is really key. A lot of public works projects, we will kind of develop a brief, and then from that brief, write a funding application. So almost all of our projects are self-generated funding. So this is an image of the neighbourhood forum that Public Works is also supporting. And so I don't know how much you know about neighbourhood forums, but it's basically about giving the community power to start influencing planning policy in the area. So you can protect certain assets that have value. So like listing, but opposed to listing its material value, you're listing its sort of social value within the local area. But then you can also start to propose planning policy. So in a very proactive way, you can start to affect how your community is going to change and develop. And within the Roman Road, there are 8 wards or kind of groups that we then consult that then develops the overall plan. But from these kind of consultations, there's a real drop in participation from post-war estates. And so what happens as a result is often community neighbourhood forums are very dominated by basically white middle-class people. And there are sort of certain groups who just have no voice. And as a result, it's actually not very representative of an area. So these are all the post-war estates, and these are also all the kind of holes in our community forum. So the idea behind the project of starting a sort of garden on one of these estates is also looking at how the garden can be a way to sort of bring these groups together and empower them to then also start to inform other neighbourhood-wide issues, such as the neighbourhood forum. So I think it's really interesting at the moment within the kind of, a lot of the legislation at the moment to do with the Localism Act. There's a lot around giving power back to communities, but then not a lot around how you capacity build to make sure that those communities can use that power and understand what that actually means. So, for instance, within the neighbourhood forum, a lot of the language it's very dense and it's very inaccessible. So as a result, there's actually a very small group of people who feel comfortable talking in those kind of settings. In contrast, I think gardening projects are really interesting because there's a kind of equality between who can garden. It often doesn't have an awful lot to do with class. You've got the kind of allotment movements where very working class people have a kind of real skill set. But it's also a way of making a real change to an urban area. And so I'm quite interested in the project of how gardening can become a tool to then start a wider conversation about urban change. and how kind of tangible that change can be. So this is the estate that I'm working on. So this is the Old Ford estate, which has about 5,000 homes on. It's got 3 large towers and then low-rise blocks. It also has an adventure playground, which is quite interesting. So it's run by the Housing Association, but children from all over the local area come there and they play through risk. So the idea is that they build their own playground as a way of learning about risk. I've been working with this community for about a year now. The towers are largely Somali and Bangladeshi and are first-generation immigrants. And as a result, there's very poor language skills in the mothers, but very good language skills in the children. So kind of, when I was initially working on the project, you did a lot of working with the children as a way of engaging to then start to bring the mothers along to the sessions. Also, what's quite interesting, so when I started the project, the housing association was called Old Ford, and they went bust and got sued for negligence because they hadn't repaired the water systems within the towers. And since then, the tower blocks have been bought by Clarion, who is the biggest housing association provider in the UK. So you've gone from what was an incredibly small housing association that was kind of really negligent to now something that's very efficient but so large and so bureaucratic. So quite a lot of my role through the project was also talking to these communities about what that change meant and how it was affecting them day to day, sort of what was improving, which was that their plumbing was being repaired, but also that they no longer had community officers on the ground. They no longer had that kind of social infrastructure that the old housing association provided. So yeah, this is the estate. And so my orchard is, so it's just this one here. And since I graduated from university, the Saviles Report came out, which is a piece, it's a report generated by Saviles, the estate agents. And what's quite interesting, it's attacking post-war housing and really attacking it as a typology. So it's talking about the idea of, the kind of phrase that always comes up in the report is this idea of the incomplete street. And that post-war housing creates incomplete streets. And I think this is really interesting because, in a sense, what that report supports is a political movement, which is away from the provision of social housing for our population. But then it starts to use sort of language around an architectural typology to devalue it, to talk about why these estates have to be developed, why they have to be sold on, why they can't be kept within communities. So I became really interested in this idea of what is an incomplete street, these green spaces that exist between post-war housing, and actually, why is this a really positive urban typology? Why is it something we should save? What are the social conditions it creates? So just sort of starting the project, the very first thing we did was we sort of just started to plant. I think it's quite interesting. There's a really interesting project in Germany called Park Fiction, where they talk about this idea of parallel narratives. So how often to initiate a project, you have to show that the project will work. You have to show that there are already people who are engaged in it. So in some ways, you almost have to have the project before you can get permission to do the project. So as a result, what we did is we went to Growing Concern, who are the people who look after the green spaces on the estate, and we asked them, what can you do within your remit? What does the council allow you to do? And they said that they are allowed to plant wildflowers. And if we wanted to plant wildflowers with the community, they were very happy as long as we don't do anything else, and we let them know where we're going to plant them. So we just started by planting these wildflowers as kind of community days. And the role of these days was about gathering volunteers, but also kind of gathering evidence to present to the Housing Association to say, there's a group of people, they're really engaged in gardening, they can really look after this. And it was really interesting when we were talking to Clarion that as soon as you talked in terms of numbers, so on average we get 50 volunteers per event, and our mailing list is about 70 residents. The conversation totally changed. You start to kind of tick their sort of criteria of what they're meant to be producing every year for their community engagement. And then again, within that, we started a watering rota. So a different mother from the estate, I mean, it didn't have to be mothers, but it was, as it turned out, would water the flowers every day, which is actually a vast amount of work you don't really need to do for wildflowers. But as a result, we had this kind of rota of these 7 women who were coming out every single day. And then they would talk to other people on the estate, and it became a way of kind of bringing momentum for the project. So yeah, this is one of our planting days with the residents. So we kind of, as we had these sort of like large events where we'd lift the turf, we'd have music, people would bring cakes. And I think I was really interested in how these days as community projects were really well attended, like compared with lots of our other public works projects. I had to put in very little effort and I was getting a lot of people coming. And I think that was linked to the fact that the project was situated within people's homes. So, you know, if you put up a table outside someone's home, they come out and ask you what you're doing. They already care about that land, they already care about that space, and that engagement's already there. And I think it's really interesting when you think about these kind of incomplete streets that Saviles was talking about. In a sense, they create what is an urban common. It's not owned by a single individual, but a group have a very close relationship to that space. And that's, I think, a really interesting and important urban typology, because it's not a public space, you're not anonymous, you're still close to your home, you can, you know, bring out a sound system when the musician was late, or you bring a jug of juice because we're all planting together. But at the same time, it's not a private space. We can host events, we can do things publicly and collectively. And so I think this idea of this sort of semi-public private space where the home is hosted within the public realm is really interesting, but also really important. And it relates a lot back to the kind of initial ideas around post-war housing, this idea of kind of dense housing where then people collectively share resources like green space. And it's really important to revisit these projects and reinitiate that initial ambition through events as a way of kind of getting people out to kind of work and act collectively. So this is our planting plan, which is quite, okay. It's quite dry and boring, but this was a kind of back and forth with the council, with the Housing Association, Clarion. So it took us 8-hour-long meetings with 6 people present at the meeting to establish that this was all right to plant. So as you can see on this plan, we've got the kind of wildflowers along the perimeter. And that was fine to plant because that was what Growing Concern were already doing. But these trees were kind of a constant negotiation. And it was quite interesting, the ambition to plant the trees came from the residents. When we knocked on people's doors, everyone's kind of first reaction was, we want more trees on the estate, because the tree budget had been cut, so they'd cut down all the trees in the estate. And then the other thing that kept on coming up was, within the whole of this estate, there wasn't a single bench. And all the kind of older residents kept on saying, we want benches, we want to be able to sit outside. And then when you obviously go to the council, then to the Housing Association, their response is, yeah, but a tree can get pulled up, it's high risk, someone could fall off it. And a bench, you could have antisocial behaviour on it, so we can't risk that. And so quite a lot of the project was kind of talking about how do you design spaces for risk? Why is actually the risk of a bench worth it for the social importance of that bench for the community? And is it actually a greater risk for older residents to have nowhere to sit outside their homes, so then they stay in home and then they feel isolated? And I think this kind of attitude to risk and how you illustrate the value of something as well as its risk was a really important conversation. So yeah, eventually we got to 12 trees agreed as planting. Yeah, this is another one of our planting days. So this was after we'd kind of got the okay from the Housing Association and we started to plant the trees. Again, I think you can't quite see it in this photo, but just off to the left, there's the adventure playground. And that was really important for the project because every time we did anything, lots of the children from the adventure playground would come and sort of start digging and things. And because there's a very large Somali population in the area, there's a lot of sort of gangs of young Somali boys who go around the estate. And that was one of the big things that kept on coming up every time we went to the council, was that these gangs would pull up the trees and that we couldn't plant the trees because then they get pulled up straight away. So it kind of started with a guy called Mo, who was part of one of these gangs, but he came to one of my planting days. very early on. And so we then, every time we had an event, we asked Mo if he could bring all his friends. And in groups of 3, they ended up planting the trees, and each of them named a tree. And so then their role was that if they saw anyone doing anything to a tree, they had my number and they had to let me know. And they committed that if they planted the tree, they wanted the tree on the estate. And a big part of that conversation was also saying, if you don't want the tree, don't plant it. Like, I'm not saying you have to dig this tree, and if you don't want us to plant these. So it kind of, that engaging with the problem head on and really directly was incredibly important for the project. And again, as a kind of, I suppose, opposed to thinking that things can't happen within these situations because there's this sort of high risk of it going wrong, the project sort of tried to really directly engage with what those problems could be and meet those people who were the kind of perceived problem people. Another thing we did as part of the project, so of the 10 grand we got as funding, 6 of it was meant to be capital funding. So that's funding you spend on trees, equipment, and also like food and things for the events. In the end, we didn't actually spend any of our capital funding because everything we used in the project was donated. And that became a really important kind of element of the project, was a way of showing what the value of this project is for the local economy and for the local people. So I suppose to start with, all the trees were donated by Growing Concern because they look after the green spaces, but we're saying no one really knew about what their role was or what they did. So if we could talk about Growing Concern, we could have these 12 trees for free. So that was kind of our first big saving. We then got donated tools by a local gardening sort of seller, like sort of merchant, who again said that if we would talk about him when we were planting, then we could have that for free. And then this image is, so all the food from the events by the end was donated by the local high street. And in return, the children from the estate would write them notices that they put in their windows saying, thank you from the Old Ford estate, and then their names as a kind of a thank you for their support of the day. And again, I think a lot of other public works projects around the Roman Road is looking at how an independent high street can survive. And I think projects like this are really key of how you start to kind of develop ad campaigns or publicity or kind of positive local feeling through community events, and what value you're generating and how it goes beyond the kind of the estate but also to the road. So this is us. So we were visiting another local growing project that's been going for about 10 years, just as a way to kind of look at what they've done, how they've got to this point, how they've sustained themselves. So this is Alison. I actually also do some projects for this garden as well, which is Abbey Gardens. And so she is there 3 days a week now and runs a kind of, runs these volunteer sessions, and then they have 5 events a year. A big bit of our funding wasn't just on the planting, but it was also about setting up a gardening group. And so the idea of capacity building with the community, so they would be able to run the garden once it was finished. And again, I suppose, in a way like this image shows, it was about getting the kind of groups who weren't very active within the community to start to form groups and to see how they could have a role. And how you can start to support them. So I think it's quite a good example is Pala, who's the lady just next to Alison with the headscarf. Through the project, kind of talking to her over cups of tea, it turned out that her flat was leaking and she hadn't told anyone because she didn't realise she had the right to complain if your housing is leaking. And again, I think that's really interesting within these kind of high-density post-war estates. You need to really understand the lines of communication, how you let the housing association know when things are going wrong. And these projects are a really important way of doing that as a way for these people to start to meet people locally who can support them. And so as a result of that, Jyoti, who's very involved with the project, then helped her get in touch with the housing association and fix the leak in her block, which is obviously fantastic for her, but because she lived in a high-rise block, it was fantastic for everyone below her who also had been experiencing leaks and didn't know where they came from. And then this is our last event, which was a Solstice Plant. So these are our orchard ambassadors. So they're young people on the estate who support the project, and they were the ones who were involved with planting those trees. And everyone who planted a tree got given a house plant. And then at every event, they had to bring their house plant back and tell us how it was growing. And this was our house plant show at the end of the year. So this is Daniela and Victoria, and they're Slovakian. And they came second in our houseplant show, which was, yeah, they were very happy about. So I suppose, yeah, going forward, this year I've got funding to plant a further 3 orchards in the area. And I think what we found is this kind of conversation with Clarion. They've been really supportive, but then there's also been real challenges. And in a sense, we've been so reliant on them for permission, but also for they're funding the project next year. But then obviously if the funding doesn't come through, then how do we carry on operating? So going forward, we're looking to see if we can start orchards in other housing associations and see how, by linking up these orchards as groups, we can start to kind of almost create a conversation between the different housing associations in the area and the residents who are living there. So they can start to kind of talk about what's going wrong, what happened, what's really well provided for by the housing association, or what are they really lacking, understand how other groups have sort of had these conversations and have fixed these problems. So we're looking at planting another Clarion orchard, one in Gateway Homes, and then another one in Tower Hamlet Homes. And I think what's been really interesting within the project is that you end up seeing how some people have a real richness or a lot of real value in one area and a total lack in another. So for instance, with volunteers, we got a lot of mothers helping us because basically they've got a huge amount of time on their hands and have a real investment in the local area because they've got small children, and so they're really happy to kind of push the project forward. And equally, their children are the ones who then know the sort of Somali and the Bangladeshi children, which then became a way to then meet those mothers. So the network of people grew through kind of using this resource of volunteers. And again, I think that's kind of now going on to the next step of the project. We're in conversation with these other housing associations. It's looking at what one housing association provides a lot for and another one has a different funding focus, and how by working between them you can kind of start to cross-fund. So for instance, Gateway does a lot for community gardens but not very much for community engagement, and then Tower Hamlet Homes, the other way is true. So I think in a way that idea of networking becomes really important. And this idea of a common, so where you have multiple things existing that all have slightly different kind of ambitions, or they want different outcomes to the project. They pull it in different ways, but they also give different skills or values to the project. Yeah.